Okay, so we're here for cultural geography. This is Monday. What is this? The 31st of August. So, okay, so the first day of the second week. So, let me say as an announcement for everybody to check your Blackboard announcements regularly because from me, you will get at least 2 Blackboard announcements per week. There's a Blackboard announcement right now that I posted this morning sometime, or maybe yesterday, I can't remember, but it's about week 2 and what the logistics are. So this is week 2. We don't really know the logistics exactly, for every class yet. So I posted kind of a roadmap appropriate for a geography class. I posted kind of a roadmap about how we're supposed to do this class like through Blackboard, whether you're virtual or face-to-face, you've got the same stuff on Blackboard. So the announcement talks about how there's always going to be videos. For this particular class, there's going to be 3 videos per week. They will be 30 minutes or so each. They are required. You take notes on them. Quiz questions will come from them. So we're going to have a video for Monday, for Wednesday, and then whether you're face-to-face or virtual, everybody's virtual on Friday. We will also have another video on Friday, and then I will look back at all the videos we haven't been quizzed on yet. I'll make the quiz. It'll be on Blackboard. It's due on Sunday at noon. Right? The reaction papers are always due Saturday at noon. So anything we haven't been quizzed over yet is fair game for a reaction paper. Please remember the schedule for reaction papers and the schedule for quizzes. It's always in course content. What else was I going to say about that just now? And there's other that's what I was going to say. There's other requirements for reaction papers that you've got to make sure that you pay attention to, because I don't like reading a reaction paper and then having to tell the author of that, having to tell the student that they didn't follow one of the guidelines and therefore you don't get credit. That's not a fun time for me. I like to say, this was a really interesting reaction paper and you have a good point for here, or you're a little bit off on your meaning of this and please correct that. I like those kinds of concepts or those kinds of comments where I get to say credit at the end, right? So please make sure that you don't have to memorize those rules because that's why they're posted there, for you to always review. Oh yeah, and a couple people sent me a text over the weekend and asked if I would look at what they were doing for their reaction paper and give them pointers on whether it was right or not. And the answer is no. I can't essentially grade your reaction paper twice. It's not personal. I just can't do that with all the students that I've got. So follow those guidelines and post something. And if you follow those guidelines, you will get credit for it. And if it's a little bit different than what I was hoping for or what I wanted, it will be clear to you in the comment that I give you. When I read those and grade those, I will always give you a comment with details if there's anything that you need to switch up, or just an attaboy kind of comment when you have everything perfect. So okay, so I guess those are the announcements. Each of the videos also, please remember that at the beginning, since this is normal class time, at the beginning I'm going to be making announcements that the class needs to know about. So it's kind of your job to get logistics from the very beginning of class. Okay? Alrighty, so our very last video that we watched for the Friday lecture, I actually recorded it last semester. I think I said that at the very beginning of the video. I recorded it last semester, and it is over some key elements in culture geography that we're going to need to use. We're going to need to keep them kind of like on the back burner of our mind, not really back burner, we need it at the forefront for cultural geography throughout every single chapter, every single topic that we cover from here on out, okay? So that topic was Mr. Help. I'm not going to review what Mr. Help means, but essentially, let me tell you what page numbers in chapter 1 it covers. There is a section on the 5 themes of geography. Where does it begin? Let's see. Flipping back. Okay, it says it's on page 7 of chapter 1. I'm in the 12th edition. So it's on page 7, and it's identifying and explaining geography's core concepts. This acronym, Mr. Help, stands for each of those core concepts. There are 5 themes of geography. Movement, region, that's an R. Movement, region, human-environment interaction, location, and place. when you're reading them in chapter 1, the author of your textbook does not put them in this order. A lot of cultural geography teachers, though, just to give you kind of an easy way to remember it, will reorder stuff and put it in the, Mr. Help, right? It's an easy thing to remember, and now all you have to do is remember the movement, the region, human-environment interaction, location, and place. Okay, these are key points. If I didn't emphasize it enough in the video you watched on Friday, these are key points that you're going to need to know pretty well, all the nuances of them pretty well, in order for you to be able to do well on project 1, which we will talk about at the end of this week or early next week. We'll talk about what it is, and I'll explain it to you, and I'll give it to you, and we'll figure out a due date for it. Okay? Alrighty. So make sure when you're taking these notes, follow along in your textbook, because region, for instance, there are lots of different types of regions. There's lots of different types of movement, for instance. It's not just movement of physical goods, say from a country of origin to the place where they're going to be sold. It's not just a movement of people from one place to the next. It's movement of ideas. Just before I started this video, we were talking about live streaming and chats and stuff like that. You could be on a live stream. What's the name of the platform you were telling me about? Mixer. So you could be on Mixer in one of the live streams looking at somebody else's video games that they're recording and posting, and they might be in South Korea, they might be in Morocco, they might be in Canada, and you're right there exchanging ideas. You're not actually physically moving, but you're exchanging ideas through cyberspace, right? So movement has a whole bunch of nuances. It's much more than getting in your car or getting on a bus and following the bus route to the next place that's part of movement, but that's not the only part of movement. So there is a section in chapter 1, and if you don't have your book yet, please make sure that you get it on order right away if it's not there, if it's not already on order for you. The 11th edition will work just fine, 10th will also. Anything older than that, check with me. And the page numbers might not be exactly right. But one of the things that I want to suggest for a reaction paper this week, I want to suggest this for a couple of reasons. It'll help you remember Mr. Help and the nuances of Mr. Help, but it's also a topic that we have always discussed in cultural geography class, and that is disease vectors. Let me write this on the board. A vector is a word from physics class. It's a word from optical physics, where something goes this direction. There I just drew a vector on the board, and this direction I just drew another vector, and here's another vector, okay? So a vector is a path, a trajectory, to use another physics word, a path that something follows. It's key to movement. It's key to understanding how things move. There's a section in chapter 1 on a disease that some of y'all might not really know about, might not have heard about before. Historians probably talk about it a lot, I would imagine. But there is a disease that really killed a whole bunch of people, a terrible violent death, really convulsive, and you have like diarrhea and terrible, terrible conditions with fever from cholera. It was extremely contagious, and it was a worldwide pandemic, as we are going through right now. Thank heavens, as deadly as coronavirus is, thank heavens it does not seem to have the widespread, terribly violent death, physically violent death. It's almost like when I read about what happens with cholera, it sounds like, it reminds me of what happens with like detox, if somebody's coming off a chemical detox and it's like a really violent thing for the physical body. Anyway, so cholera was a global pandemic, and pandemic and epidemic, these are two different words that you'll read about in chapter 1, or read about on the web if you want to look up cultural geography, cholera, disease vectors, and that kind of stuff. But a pandemic, we maybe didn't know what that word meant before, last semester maybe, had never even really thought about that word past 9th grade, history class or whenever we learned about it. But a pandemic is a disease that spreads globally. So we're talking about movement here. We're talking about movement with Mr. Health. And some regions of the world are affected more profoundly than other regions of the world. How do human beings respond to that disease vector? How do we change our habits? How do we change parts of the environment, maybe offer water treatment resources or something like this? What locations, what places are permanently marked or permanently changed because of these kinds of things? So cholera is a historic pandemic. And remember, in geography class, we look at the same things historians do, but we look at in a different way, right? Where, why, how, these are the major questions that we want to know. So when a cultural geographer looks at the cholera pandemic, and then as it transitioned from a pandemic to still it is an epidemic, which is a disease that affects regions specifically. So regional outbreaks of a disease would be epidemic, whereas global outbreaks of a disease would be a pandemic, okay? So cholera transitioned from a pandemic to it still is an issue in a lot of places worldwide, particular locations worldwide, and humans are trying to figure out a way to manipulate the environment to eradicate it, for instance. But these disease vectors, where does a disease begin? How does it travel? Is it going to be contained within a certain place, a certain location? Is it regional? Or will it be pandemic, for instance? So, now that I step back and look at these notes, that might not be extremely helpful that I just have one word on the board here and there. But the reason I'm writing this is because you don't have to choose this as your reaction paper topic. But if you do, look at the section in our textbook on cholera, and you can find lots of articles about cholera and the spread of cholera if you don't have your textbook yet. You can go ahead and get an outside source by doing this. But if you look at cholera and cultural geography and how we look at the regions that it's affected, how humans react to the environment to control it, how we change our culture to control it, and you can compare, it would be a really good exercise that will help you do really, really well on that first project that's 50 points. If you compared Mr. Help, all of the 5 themes of geography. Hey, where did cholera start? Where did it move? Why did it move? See, those are my first 2 questions, where and why. Why did it move? The why is going to help us know later on, how do we manipulate it? How do we interact with this environmental thing that's happening in order to control, in order to quell that? That's a good word. To quell something means to like get it under control. That's not a geography word. It's just a good college level vocabulary word that you can incorporate into your regular conversations because you're in college now. So quell, to kind of like suppress, to kind of like control it, to get it under control is what quell means. At least I think that's what Siri would say it means. So y'all ask Siri what it means to be absolutely sure. Okay, so and you don't have to just look at cholera and Mr. Help. Cholera as a pandemic and how it was controlled, and now it's just an epidemic, and what issues are being addressed right now, human rights issues and social justice issues that are being addressed right now globally to deal with the environment so that even epidemic problems having to do with cholera aren't an issue anymore. But compare it to what we're dealing with coronavirus. And your reaction paper only has to be 400 words, so you do not have to go into depth in this very much at all. And you might not even want to branch out into coronavirus, since we are kind of like bombarded with that everywhere right now. But if you look at this historic pandemic that we've had, look at it as a geographer, you can make some comparisons to coronavirus if you would like. It'll just be a really, really good exercise for you to be in practice, and it'll also give me an opportunity to like check your work in your reaction paper and give you some feedback that when we get the Project 1, which is not going to be about disease vectors. It is going to be about analyzing something using Mr. Help, but you will have done it already and gotten my feedback about it, so it's like some good practice. Okay? You have any questions? We're good? Okay, so let me see what page the cholera stuff is on. And did I mention that in the textbook, I think I mentioned that in the textbook, the Mr. Help, the 5 themes of geography are not in this same order. I think the textbook author starts with location and then does place and then maybe region and movement, that kind of thing. What page is the cholera stuff on? Okay, yeah. It's on page 4. So the spatial perspective, it starts there. And then on page 5 it says understanding the causes and spread of cholera in 1854. Okay, so that'll help you practice thinking in a geographic way instead of thinking in a historian's kind of way with the who, what, where questions that a historian gives. We want why, where, and how. Okay? All right. So there are some other key terms that are important for understanding the 5 themes of geography, particularly movement and human-environment interaction. Well, location, place, all of them actually. I'm trying to narrow it down to fewer than 5. But here is a word you have probably heard of before in other classes: diffusion. Okay? So, science classes use this word a lot when something spreads or permeates the ground or spreads out into whatever kind of substance you're looking at in chemistry class or biology. Diffusion is the spread. For cultural geographers, we talk about it, it's the spread of a cultural element from a center where it developed to other places in the world. Center where it developed to other places in the world. Diffusion. Something starts someplace. There is some sort of center where something starts. We call that, in cultural geography, a cultural hearth. What's a hearth? You've heard that word before? Okay, a hearth is a word that whenever I hear it, I usually think of a fireplace, because a hearth is like the space on a fireplace where you're building the fire back here, and the hearth is something made out that's not flammable, where it controls the fire, right? But you're starting a fire at the hearth, okay? So that's what a hearth is like in somebody's house, all right? A hearth. It's where a fire begins. Fires can spread, right? We start fires at a hearth, but they can spread. A cultural hearth is the center for where a cultural trait or a cultural element begins. And typically, that cultural hearth is going, there are many cultural hearths. For instance, last semester I remember somebody wrote a reaction paper about how New Orleans was the cultural hearth for jazz music. They have moved on to UALR now. I think they're majoring in a musical instrument or something. She was a musician. But anyway, she wrote about how New Orleans was the cultural hearth for jazz and talked about specific instruments that were really popular there that have spread kind of up the Mississippi River. She was talking about diffusion. She was talking about movement of cultural traits, and New Orleans being the hearth, the center where that particular type of thing began. Years and years ago, I had another music lover, and they talked about bluegrass music, Okay, so bluegrass music, there is, there's kind of a fight over whether that's actually a Kentucky thing or maybe it's Illinois, right? But anyway, there's a cultural hearth or two that can be identified as the places where it began, and now, of course, we spread out. And bluegrass has bluegrass stayed entirely within its own little, or jazz, either of those musical genres, have they stayed within their own little capsules and they haven't influenced anything in society except just that music? Not really. I mean, you have rock and roll that's influenced by bluegrass. You have country music that's influenced by bluegrass. Definitely gospel music that is like bluegrass gospel music. And I've had some folks talking about bluegrass recently in a class that I'm taking or that I took at Arkansas State University in Jonesboro. Some people argue that it's not really bluegrass unless it has something about God and Jesus in it. Some people argue that, that's the pure form of bluegrass. But bluegrass, jazz, any of these kinds of things, rock and roll, heavy metal, started out in, I think it was Portland or Seattle or someplace like that, has spread. It's a cultural element that begins at a certain place, a cultural hearth, and it spreads from that place to other places in the region first, in the world next, can globalize. But a really good question about how it spreads, one of those cultural geography questions, how, it's interesting to see the ways in which things morph from their original purpose or their original condition into new cultural things as they spread from one region to the next. And please analyze what I'm saying here. Pick up how many times, I've got one of the 5 themes of geography in this definition, right? I've said region how many times? Movement how many times? How things change. So there's a human interaction, right? So just in these last 15 minutes, however long it's been that we've been talking about this issue, all of the 5 themes of geography are present in what we are discussing. So in Project 1, that's what I'm going to give you. I'm going to give you a scenario, a movie to watch, a TV show to watch, a topic to do a little research on, and analyze it not from a historian's point of view, but from the cultural geographer's point of view. These five themes of geography, and they are everywhere, right? If you hook your brain up in the culture geography way. That's not the expression I was looking for, but if you flip the switch, so you're asking the geography questions as opposed to the other kinds of questions that we might have more experience with in our schooling up to this point. Okay, one of the things that, back to the cholera topic a minute ago, in your textbook, when you're looking at the definition of a cultural hearth, or if you ask Siri or you look it up on Google, a cultural hearth usually talks about, as I've got written here, a cultural element or trait that begins someplace and then spreads. Wherever the place is that it begins, that's the hearth. However, we can expand that definition a little bit more because particularly with coronavirus, we have a hearth, we have a center where we think with pretty good confidence, scientific confidence, that it started in one particular place. And then in that location, it spread and it traveled from, throughout the region, it moved across the world, and that's how we ended up with a pandemic. So technically, you can use this word, the hearth, the cultural hearth, to not only talk about physical objects that people make, use, and modify for their own reasons, but you can also talk about how those disease vectors sometimes can be centered around a cultural hearth or two. I have heard, I don't know the accuracy of whether it was a laboratory or whether it was a food market. I haven't researched that part myself, but particularly with the coronavirus, I think some people have identified a general region where there is a cultural hearth for the beginning of that. Okay, questions? We're good? Okay, so one more topic that I want to cover today. Let me find the page number for you. Jumping scales, where is it? We will talk about all of the maps, the mental maps, and the actual biases in maps. We will do that on Wednesday when I bring some maps in here to show you. Where's the sequent occupancy? Is that in the next one? I might be jumping into the next chapter with the topic I was going to discuss right now. Nope, there it is. Okay. All right, so it is in chapter 1. Oh, I was looking for the page number. It's page 16 in chapter 1 is our next topic. So we have cultural elements that maybe that start at a cultural hearth and then can spread throughout the land. And now there's 2 additional words that we're going to talk about today before we're finished with our lesson. One of them is the cultural landscape, and another one is called sequent occupancy. Sequent occupancy. Let me write that more clearly because I need to remember that this has to go on YouTube and y'all have to be able to see it, don't you? Not just here, because I don't know if YouTube can spell this correctly in the captions, so who knows? So this is on page 16 in chapter 1. Okay. In geography class, part of Mr. Help is about locations, it's about places, it's about regions. We have perceptions in our mind. We talked about this in class on Friday. There are perceived places, perceived locations, perceived regions. These are things that don't really have a particular spot on a map necessarily. A cultural landscape is like that. A cultural landscape is the ways in which our human behavior, our human rituals and customs are spread out across the landscape. Okay, so it's sort of like the human signature. It's the human signature on the environment, on the place, on the location, on the region. It's the human signature where behaviors, customs, traditions, rituals, all of the things that go along with human behavior, beliefs. I think it was this class on Wednesday last week, we talked about the Bible Belt, or maybe that was my sociology class, but we talked about how there is a cultural landscape called the Bible Belt. It is a perceptual region. It doesn't necessarily have a map that everybody agrees upon. Okay, here's my terrible drawing. Let me try to get the United States up here just from my mental scape of the map. Okay, so here's Maine is up there. There's Florida, Texas, California. Oh, ew, it's a little bit too postage stamp, isn't it? But okay, so and Maine kind of sticks out a little bit more. There's Texas. Here we are. Okay. So that's bad, but it's done. So if you give cultural geographers and behavior scientists a map of the United States, they're not all going to have the exact same lines around the exact same region. It's more of a perceptual region, this Bible Belt, but the cultural landscape in the Bible Belt has certain behaviors, customs, traditions, etc., that you should expect the people there to follow. That is a really ugly United States. And California doesn't really look like that. But anyway, the Bible Belt is kind of something like this. Something like that. Even farther south some than I have drawn here. Arkansas, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, some of Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, all around here in Appalachia. This is a perceptual region where the cultural landscape is something that we've even given a name, the Bible Belt. People have more conservative behaviors, more traditionally American behaviors. Can I say that? Their beliefs are more fundamentally Christian, and their practices are more in keeping with their customs that don't really have anything to do with religious beliefs, still have religious beliefs in them. For instance, we close liquor stores in Arkansas on Sunday, and you can't buy liquor in our, like, that's not necessarily a religious belief necessarily, but there's a religious belief that has affected laws, for instance. Some companies like Chick-fil-A started in Georgia, didn't it? It started in like Athens, Georgia maybe, or someplace else in Georgia, and the founder was particularly Christian and closes it on Sunday, right? So these kinds of beliefs and behaviors affected by those beliefs would be characteristics that you could talk about in a cultural landscape. Landscapes change, cultural landscapes change, and that's partially because of one group of people moving in, taking over, moving the others out, changing the customs, traditions, rituals, and beliefs. The landscape changes. Even building architecture can change. For instance, Christian churches historically tend to have a particular architecture that's very different from what a mosque looks like, for instance, or a temple or a synagogue looks like. These things have a very different look to them. Clothing styles are also different based on what one group of people, their customs, traditions, beliefs might be compared to another. And so as conquests happen, wars happen, there's another thing that you can look at using Mr. Help as your perspective. You can look at wars and groups moving in, occupying certain places, colonization of Africa, colonization of India, colonization of what we call the New World, where we're standing right now, and how the cultural landscape changes significantly when these regime changes, really, for lack of a better word, happens. You can use archaeological records to see what happens to a cultural landscape, the physical environment, when a different series of people with a different culture come in and take over a certain place. You can literally dig into the earth, as archaeologists are trained to do in a scientific way, and look at layer after layer after layer of literally earth that has built up on top of the old level to see and learn about the sequence of occupants that have come in and out and taken over and changed things. So archaeology can give us a very, very clear picture way into the past, the distant past. In some parts of our city, Little Rock, we can look at how the cultural landscape, the human signature on certain areas changes with much more regular sequent occupancy. For instance, some of the old houses that are around the River Market area or the Quapaw Quarter area, if y'all are familiar with those regions in downtown Little Rock, big old houses that are kind of grand. I mean, they look like they must have been built by someone who had a lot of wealth and maybe influence. All of them seem to be like that. But over the years, over the decades, that region has fallen kind of out of favor by people who would have money. They've moved somewhere else, built new places or taken over other places, and those kinds of homes have been low-income people living in them, and now they're much more attractive to those people who moved way out here and they want to move back in. And so there's, in some cases, a forced sequent occupancy. When you have, what I'm talking about here, it's gentrification. Gentrification is, well, anytime there's a cation on the end, it's the process of something, right? So the gentry, this is the root word here, gentry. That's an English word that talks about gentlefolk, right? Ladies and gentlemen, like you say in a presentation. So this would be people who have wealth, people who have power and influence. And probably it was the gentry to begin with who built those kinds of houses. The gentry abandoned those kinds of houses, and now decades later, different generations of gentry are now interested again. And technically what's happening in places all over the United States, not just Little Rock, is something called a re-gentrification. Places that were built by the gentry, abandoned by the gentry, taken over by low-income housing, and now the gentry is again interested in it, re-gentrification, and it's driving the prices up and displacing people, sequent occupancy, displacing low-income people who can no longer afford the neighborhood where they grew up. They're without a place to live. And so cultural landscapes change. Many things stay the same in a cultural landscape for decades and decades and decades, centuries even. However, cultural landscapes can also change quite a bit in a short period of time, a period of 5 to 10 years, with something like gentrification, where you've got people moving in, redoing, renewing, and that kind of thing. Sounds great from one perspective. It's terrible from another perspective, right, if you're the one being kicked out of the area. So that's not to say, I'm not making a political statement about gentrification or regentrification. Politicians will make them, and they will make them loudly because it's an issue of social stratification, right? It's an issue of inequality. So that's another thing that we will look at on Wednesday when we are together again, and we look at maps, because there's a section in chapter 1 that talks about the importance of maps and all the messages that maps can give us. And some of the maps that I'm going to bring in, we're going to use to look to see, I think when I show them to you for the first time, they're just going to look like just regular old maps that you've probably seen since you started seeing maps in kindergarten and first grade and all the way up. I think you're just going to think they're regular old maps, and they are. But if you look at them with a critical eye, if you look at them and ask questions, if you look at them to analyze them for a deeper meaning, whether intended or unintended, maybe we can get more out of these maps than just what it looks like latitude and longitude and the stuff that we talked about in class on Friday, in that video on Friday. Okay? So I think that brings us to the end of class today. I think we're almost out of time, so I'll shut off the video. Any questions or anything? Okay, so Wednesday we will do what I just mentioned. And you virtual students, I will see you on Wednesday this way. Bye.